Some of you I recognize are not morning people, and you may identify with Grumpy Cat. Just like a calendar, your days are numbered. That poster right there has a common link to a song by a group called OK Go. How many of you know what OK Go is? I'm going to guess there aren't a lot, but they're a pop group that whenever they turn a video out, they're just always really creative and a lot of optical effects. And I'm just going to show you the very end of a song they did back in 2014. I want you to pick up the phrase that shows up here. The Writings on the Wall. You know what that song, that was actually the name of the song, The Writings on the Wall. You know what it and Grumpy Cat have in common? Both of them are finding their inspiration out of Daniel chapter 5. Because Daniel chapter 5 is the story about the writing being on the wall and a message being delivered that your days are numbered. That has just worked itself into our culture. In fact, I was looking this week at the number of times that people that we know around in the world have used that phrase. For instance, Larry Hagman, the old actor that was back on the show Dallas, which was a terrible show that for some reason ran for years. When they finally were going to cancel it, he said, "We all saw the writing on the wall. The ratings had been going down." Or here's one, Morris Bender, a neuroscientist. A skeptic is a person who, when he sees the handwriting on the wall, claims it is a forgery. Maybe a little more sober, Mahatma Gandhi said, "If nobody reads the writing on the wall, man will be reduced to the state of the beast whom he is shaming by his manners." And then one more. Ivan Ball, an author. "Most of us can read the writing on the wall. We just assume it's addressed to someone else." Well, all of that comes out of Daniel chapter 5. I'm going to guess a lot of those people don't really know the full story, but we know this idea that when the writing is on the wall, your days are numbered. Something ominous is in the near future. Daniel chapter 5 begins by introducing us to a new character we haven't met before in Daniel's story, and a new character who's at a big party. King Belshazzar. Up to this point, we've read about King Nebuchadnezzar. Now it's King Belshazzar. Has made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. One of the first questions is, who was Belshazzar? For a long time, scholars thought that the fact that Belshazzar's name is included here, that he's listed as being a king of Babylon, was evidence of a historical error in the book of Daniel. Because we had a pretty good lineage that told us what the succession of kings were. We know that Daniel, of course, was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor of Babylon, reigned from 605 to 562, and his successor was not Belshazzar. It was Amel-Marduk, also known as Evil Merodach. That's kind of an intimidating name. So Amel-Marduk reigned from 562 to 560, and his successor was not Belshazzar. It was Neriglissar. Neriglissar reigned from 560 to 556, and his predecessor was actually executed by Neriglissar. That's one way to get power. And then Neriglissar passed the throne on to not Belshazzar. It went to Lahashi-Marduk, who was his son. Lahashi-Marduk only reigned for a few months until his own officials executed him, so he wasn't real popular. And once he was out of the way, then it passed on to not Belshazzar. It went to Nabonidus. And Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon. After Nabonidus, then the kingdom of Babylon was taken over by the Persians. So everybody said, where's Belshazzar? If Daniel says Belshazzar was king, we don't see any record of it. That wasn't until later archaeology started translating a lot of cuneiform tablets that had been found, and suddenly Belshazzar's name shows up. And it turns out that Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus, and that for about 10 years, the last 10 years of Nabonidus' reign, he was absent from the great city of Babylon, and Belshazzar was a co-regent who reigned with his father. So it turned out that Nabonidus did act, or that Belshazzar did act as a king of Babylon. Belshazzar was not actually Nebuchadnezzar's biological son. There was a break in the father-son chain somewhere here, and one person killing off another. But he was a son to Nebuchadnezzar as being a successor in the line of kings. So we're finding that this character, Belshazzar, now is hosting this big, huge party. And the other question is, why such a big feast? I mean, 1,000 of his lords all brought in for this grand feast. And Daniel's story doesn't tell us specifically what the party was for, but we can tell that it's not just any ordinary party. In fact, as we get into this, we're going to see that Belshazzar does something very unusual that nobody before him had done, which tells us there's something special about this party. History, on the bigger scope, though, does give us some perspective. His father, as I said, Nabonidus, was away, and in part he was away to wage war. And the Medes and Persians, the Persian Empire, was encroaching on Babylon and trying to take them over. And 2 days before this party happens, we know from history that his father, Nabonidus, had been defeated by Cyrus, the Mede, the emperor of the Persians. And so Belshazzar certainly had to know the conflict that was going on. And with 2 days' time, he probably also knew that his father had been defeated and that the next goal for the Persians was coming for Babylon itself. So he throws a giant party, which either is Belshazzar whistling in the wind, trying to convince himself and everybody else that nothing bad is going to happen, or he's trying to pump up the troops to make one more stand, or it's this idea of, hey, eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow we die. But there is a sense of impending danger already coming down on the city of Babylon, and now here we find Belshazzar throwing this giant party for all of his leaders, for his lords. In the midst of that party, he makes a fateful decision. Verse 2, Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Now, the vessels had been in the temple a long time. Nebuchadnezzar, as this says, Nebuchadnezzar originally, when he overtook Jerusalem, part of the spoils of war was he had looted the temple, and he had brought the vessels out of the Hebrew temple back to Babylon and put them in the temple of one of his idols, one of his gods. And there they had stayed for probably the past 40, 50 years. They've just been there in the temple on display. However, it appears that they'd all been treated with respect up to this point. That the Babylonians themselves were polytheists. They had lots of different gods, and so they were willing to let Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, kind of have a place among all the other gods that they worshiped, they thought were out there. So they had treated those vessels with respect. The question, and why is it, all of a sudden, after 50 years of not bothering him, Belshazzar decides it's time to bring those vessels out of the temple and to use them at the party to drink from. Now, it's not because they were short on tableware. We know that everybody already has their cups. They're already drinking wine, so why bring in these vessels? They've been drinking wine already. It's possible that this is one of those good decisions that people make when they've had too much to drink. Although while the alcohol may have lowered the inhibitions, it didn't bring about anything in Belshazzar, I don't think, that wasn't already there. Belshazzar was not just showing off the spoils of war. He is using vessels that were dedicated to the worship of Yahweh. He's using them specifically to make sacrifices and give honor to his own Babylonian gods. It may well have been a way of saying that our gods will give us victory over the Persians, just like our gods gave us victory over the Israelites, kind of showing off their stuff. And in doing that, they did something that not even Nebuchadnezzar had ever done. It says they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. The narrator makes it clear that they brought the gold and silver vessels out of the temple, And they use those vessels to offer up praise, to make sacrifice to their gods who were made of the very same stuff, gold and silver and stone. And it's making the point that they are looking to something that can't help them to be their salvation. The prophet Isaiah has a rather lengthy piece of writing about the foolishness of worshiping idols in Isaiah 44. I'm going to give you just a piece of it, but I think it makes the point. Isaiah 44, verses 13 through 17, this is condensed. He says, "The carpenter cuts down cedars. Half of it he burns in the fire, and over that half he eats meat, he roasts it, is satisfied. Also he warms himself. The rest of it he makes into a god, his idol, and falls down to it and worships it. He prays to it and says, 'Deliver me, for you are my God.'" Isaiah says, do you see the foolishness of this? What people do to take an inanimate thing, and over one half of it they make breakfast, and over the other half they say, "You are my God, deliver me." And so it is with Belshazzar. He takes things that were supposed to be used to the worship of the one true God, who is not represented by gold and silver or stone, and instead they begin to worship things that cannot deliver them. And then there is a haunting turn of events. Daniel 5:5. "Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote." We don't know if Belshazzar was the only one that saw the hand, but everybody saw the writing. It was obvious. It was right there in front of the lampstand. And the effect is dramatic. The king's color changed. That means he turned white with fear. And his thoughts alarmed him. His mind is going crazy, and his limbs gave way. He just had to sit down. He is scared to death at what he sees happening on this wall, this disembodied hand writing on the wall. And then it says his knees knocked together. A lot of scholars believe that that is actually a euphemism for losing control of his bodily functions. I will let you do the translation as to what that means, but this guy was scared. And the king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. I think called loudly is an understatement. He's screaming, "Get somebody in here. What's on the wall? What happened? What was that hand?" And so the usual list of people show up, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers, and he offers them a great reward if they can solve this mystery. The king declared, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple, have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Which is an interesting phrase because remember I talked about the fact that Belshazzar was co-regent with his father. So third is the highest he could go. His father was number one, he was number two, next rank up is number three. He says, "Listen, I'll put you in line right behind me if you can tell me what just happened and what does that mean." Well, as we've seen before, just when you need them most, these guys don't come through. Nobody can tell him what the writing on the wall means. So what was on the wall? Well, here it is. The writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. 3 words. The first word is repeated twice, and that's a way of giving emphasis to it. It's like adding an exclamation point. Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. Now, why couldn't these guys read these? I just read them. You can read them. Look in your text. They're right there. It's just why couldn't they read it? They were written in common Aramaic, so what was the problem? Well, one scholar, Al Wolters, has an interesting theory, and I think he's right. There was an ancient form of writing, and we find this in Hebrew, it was written this way, called scripta continua. What that means is there are no breaks between words. It's just a solid line of script. And not only that, at least in Hebrew, and he thinks at this time in this Aramaic writing, there are no vowels, no vocalizations. You realize vowels play an important part in making sense of language. If you just see a line of consonants, Your tongue doesn't even know what to do with that. How do you sound out a bunch of consonants in a line? And so without those, you don't know really what the words mean. You don't know where to split the words up. So if that's true, here's what it probably will look like on the wall. Those little apostrophes there, those are actually letters. And here's just this string of consonants. You know it's writing, you know it's recognizable, but you don't know what it means. Well, we're going to come back to Dr. Wolter's theory later, but whatever the case, these guys don't know what's going on. So enters another character. The queen mother, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, "O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods." Now, one of the questions is, the text doesn't look like it here, but in any case, this was a queen mother. Who is this? It could have been Belshazzar's own mother, but if so, her name has been lost to history. It could have also been his grandmother. She was very venerated, highly honored in Babylonian culture. Her name was Adad Guppy, which is kind of a funny name. She lived to be 104 years old, but it appears that she had died sometime before this. And it is quite possibly that the woman being referred to is Nitocris, who was the surviving widow of Nebuchadnezzar. And as you see how her speech unfolds, this makes a lot of sense that Nebuchadnezzar's widow was still there in the court of Belshazzar and coming to talk to him. You can tell there is some irritation in her voice. She's saying, don't let your thoughts alarm you. Don't let your color change. Pull yourself together, man. You know, you're the king. And then she goes on to talk about this man in your kingdom. She says, in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers. She says, there's someone you haven't talked to yet. He played an important role when your father, your predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar, was on the throne. In fact, it's interesting. I think it says something about a bit of disdain she has toward this young upstart king. She reminds him of just who Nebuchadnezzar was. She says, he was the king, your father, the king. Don't forget that, son. You're not the man that he was. So why hadn't Daniel already been called? Why had Nebuchadnezzar or Belshazzar not brought him in with the others? And it seems quite likely that he had simply wanted to dissociate himself from his father's counselors. He had his own people. He didn't need those people. And in fact, it's quite possibly his own disdain and his prejudice toward the Hebrew people themselves, that he saw no value in having one of them as part of his court. But he's panicked and nobody else has any answers. And so at last he does bring in Daniel. Then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king, my father, brought from Judah?" Now the queen had said, "There is a man in whom there is the spirit of the gods. He has done amazing things." But look at how Belshazzar speaks to him. He says, "So you're that Daniel, huh? One of the exiles? One of the exiles that my father captured and brought here?" There's real disrespect here. There is talking down. At this point, Daniel is a man probably nearing 80 years of age and has served with distinction in the courts of Babylon for years. And so for Belshazzar now to talk to him as though he is just a captured slave shows great disrespect to him. And he actually acts as though he only has third-hand knowledge of Daniel and his exploits. He says, "I've heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. I've heard some rumors. Someone has mentioned this to me." Do you really think that this was all new information to Belshazzar? That he'd never heard of Daniel before? He wasn't aware of his exploits? Daniel certainly wasn't. A little bit later, Daniel makes this statement. "You knew all this. you know who I am. You know what's happened. You know what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. You knew all this. The impression I get of Belshazzar is that he is a spoiled brat who is filled with lots of bravado. And he has little respect for anyone who's outside of his sphere. And in his pending failure, his calamity, rather than there being humility, there is just bragging mixed now with real fear. Well, to his credit, he offers Daniel the same reward he'd offered everybody else. He says, if you can decipher the writing on the wall, I will give you the gold chain, the purple robe, and I'll make you number 3 in the kingdom. Have at it. So here's how Daniel answers. Daniel answered and said before the king, you can wrap your gifts up and give them to yourself. No, that's not quite it. But let your gifts be for yourself. Give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. The exiled captive Daniel says to Belshazzar, the co-regent of Babylon, you don't have anything that I want. I think you see an 80-year-old statesman putting this young upstart in his place. He says, you can buy the world, but you can't buy me. I'm going to tell you what it says, but it's not because you have anything to offer me that I care one little bit about. Before Daniel interprets, though, he preaches. It's really interesting to compare Daniel 4. Last week we looked at this, where Daniel meets with his forefather, Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar had that troubling dream, you remember? Can't make sense of it. Daniel explains the dream to him, but as soon as he's explained the dream, which it's a message of judgment, it was that Nebuchadnezzar, because of his pride, was going to be tremendously humbled. But Daniel, in saying that, expresses sorrow. It troubles him to say this to the king. He says, my hope is that this is not true, that this happens to your enemies, not to you. He shows real compassion for him. And then after he's revealed it, he actually gives some counsel to the king. He says, here's something I think you can do that might stop this from happening and might prolong your reign and your prosperity. In Daniel 5, the order is reversed and Daniel starts. Actually, it's not even with counsel. It's more like kind of a fire and brimstone message. Whereas he showed a lot of care to Nebuchadnezzar, to Belshazzar, it is really just a reprimand. And he begins by recounting the story of Nebuchadnezzar. He says, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. Again, he roots Nebuchadnezzar's greatness in God's gift. So the God that Belshazzar has been dishonoring, that he's been using the vessels from the house of Yahweh to show off his superiority and his power, he says, your father's greatness was a gift to him from Yahweh. God is the one who made him great. And then he talks about his greatness and his power. But then he talks about the pride that caused his fall. When his heart was lifted up, his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly. He was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. But of course, as we saw last week, the story doesn't end there, because Nebuchadnezzar does humble himself and acknowledges that God is God. And Daniel goes on, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. Now, we might anticipate that Daniel would do for Belshazzar what he also had done for Nebuchadnezzar, and that is offer some counsel about how he could avert disaster. Here's what Daniel had said many years before to Nebuchadnezzar. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. That was a very kind word from Daniel, to go beyond just interpreting the dream and say, here's what you could do that might save your kingdom. But for Belshazzar, there is no such counsel. You, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. Belshazzar, you should have known better. You did know better. You know the history. You know what happened. You know what God did. You know what your father said. Nebuchadnezzar gave praise and honor and glory to God, and yet you have not. And not only have you not given honor to God, you've gone a step farther and you've set yourself up against God. Your predecessor elevated himself above where he should have, but you've elevated yourself against God himself. And he says, don't give me this I have heard stuff or rumor has it that this was third-hand information. He says, you knew. He says, you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. Symbolically, you have spit in God's eye. The vessels of his house have been brought in before you. You and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. You dared to use what was dedicated to the one true God, the one who gave your father greatness, to give your praise to stupid, blind, deaf idols made of common stuff. And the one that you've mocked is the one who literally holds the power over every breath that you breathe and every step that you take. If I could sum up Daniel's message, it goes something like this. What a stupid, self-centered, arrogant man-child you are. And I think if it wasn't for the fact that the Queen Mother was standing next to him, the guys with swords would have taken Daniel out for talking to the king like that. Well, that and the fact that he hasn't yet told him what the writing means on the wall, and he really wants to know. Now, if Dr. Walters is right that part of the problem was not knowing how to divvy up the letters, then God gave Daniel the key. And what Daniel does is he splits this into 3 words of 3 letters each. The first word, of course, being repeated 2 times. And those words can have 3 different meanings depending on how you vocalize them, what vowels you put with them. We can see this in English. For instance, if we take the letters BGN, okay, 3 consonants, you don't really know what that means, how to break it up, because you could do it a couple different ways. It might be the word began, or maybe it's 2 words, be gone, or maybe you're going fishing and you hope you're going to catch the big one. So without knowing those things, it's real hard to make sense of it. Now, when it comes to the Aramaic here, depending on how you vocalize it, there's at least 3 levels of meaning. And the first level, the easiest, is to see them as nouns, in which case they are the names of coins. Mina, shekel, and half shekel is how it would translate. But there's a second level, and that level is verbs, it's actions. Numbered, weighed, divided. When you hear the interpretation that Daniel gives, you'll understand the significance of this idea of being numbered, weighed like in a scale, and divided. And the third level is consequences. He has paid out, you are too light, and Persia. We'll see how that all plays out. Daniel 5:26. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Peres probably being a wordplay on Persian. Kind of an interesting side note. Daniel's giving this word of judgment as a result of this amazing sign that Belshazzar has seen written on the wall. One of the things we also know from Daniel's story is that the Babylonians were really big on studying the heavens. They put a lot of stock in the constellations and the stars. And Daniel himself, we've been told already, had been schooled in all of their arts. So this was an important thing, that these wise men would be looking at the stars to see what they could learn. And the night of this party, we know from history and from the study of astronomy, that on this night, the constellation Libra was rising in the sky. The wise men, the astrologers, would have taken note of that. And Libra is often depicted as the scales. What is Daniel's message to Belshazzar? You've been weighed in the scales, and you've come up short. Well, the result is 3 things happen. The first is that Daniel is rewarded. Belshazzar gives the command. Daniel is clothed in purple. He gets a chain of gold, and a proclamation is made that he would be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. Now, the question is, why did Daniel accept the reward when he'd already said he didn't want it? Well, I think at this point he's made it clear that he's not giving his message to get something, and he's given the message. In fact, he's given a message that by all rights he should have been struck down for in telling the king what he thought of him. And I think in Daniel's mind, if this boy king wants to throw gifts at him, well, then let him knock himself out. The other thing is, I think Daniel realizes that these gifts really are meaningless. He's already said the kingdom is going to be taken away from you, so you can name me number 3 in the kingdom, but this kingdom is over. And so all that position means nothing. Well, the second thing that happens that night is that Belshazzar does indeed lose his life. And the third thing is the kingdom is taken. Darius the Mede receives the kingdom being about 62 years old. In fact, from history, the ancient Greek historians Herodotus and Xenophon record that the downfall of Babylon, the final attack, came during a nighttime banquet, just like Daniel talks about. October 12th, 539 BC. So what do we do with this story? Does it have anything to do with us? Well, first, some words for Daniel fans. One of the things it is for me is a reminder, again, not to be discouraged when it seems like arrogant, powerful, godless people are getting the upper hand. That maybe they can spit in God's eye and it doesn't matter. While there is a mystery in God's sovereign working, to be sure, there is no leader, no matter how great, that is more than one heartbeat away from being stripped of all their power and standing before the God who made them. And so we pray, we stay faithful, and we let God do his work. It's also a reminder to me that we wait for God and wait for his timing. I think sometimes we read a story like this and we start getting ideas. Here's brave Daniel going in, making his stand, telling the king the way it is, and then putting him in his place, and we're thinking, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to call my legislator. I'm going to walk into my boss's office tomorrow morning. I'm getting my kid on the phone this afternoon, and I'm going to be like Daniel. I'm going to tell him the way it is and put him in their place. Well, could I just remind you that you're not Daniel? Daniel was uniquely situated by God. God had put Daniel in that place for that time. And Daniel had been blessed with a long and illustrious track record. He had built a reputation, enough that the queen would stand up for him and call for him to come in. And Daniel, even though he had the right to speak, the credibility to speak, he kept his silence until he was called for. He waited until God had so orchestrated the events that his audience was ready to listen. Daniel does show us, though, that there are times that we may see that God has orchestrated the situation. God has put us in a place where it is time to speak, and to speak clearly, even strongly. But I think before you rush off to go do that, you want to be sure that it really is God's timing and that he is the one who has opened the door and not you just lunging ahead. Some of us love arrogant people. Youthful pride is not a new phenomenon, as Belshazzar is proof. And some of us know the sting of children that we know we raised to know better, but they have rejected faith. They've rebelled. Or we have a spouse who doesn't embrace our faith and, in fact, laughs at it. Or family or coworkers that make a mockery out of the fact that you're a follower of Jesus. And we read a story like Nebuchadnezzar's, the father of Belshazzar, who was humbled by God and came to his senses and said, God, you are God. And we think, yeah, that's it, God. Do that. Do that for my family member. Do that for those people. They would see you for who you really are. And then we get to a story like Belshazzar, and our hearts sink because it says that some rebels are rebels until the end, and they never do get it figured out. And so then we're left thinking, well, what do we do? I want a Nebuchadnezzar outcome, not a Belshazzar outcome. And I think what it brings us back to is that we have to just pray, and we have to wait and let God work. You don't need to orchestrate the situation. Some of us are so eager to help God out. We're looking for all kinds of ways to help him out. You know, Daniel could have snuck in the night before with some spray paint and graffitied the wall. You know, this guy needs this message. You know, I'm going to make sure he gets it. I don't think Daniel had any idea how God was going to intervene. Daniel wasn't sitting in his room thinking, well, the handwriting should start about now. It was a surprise to him that this was how God chose to intervene. Daniel was simply ready when the time came and when God had opened the door. You may have to wait a long time. Belshazzar's bad behavior had been going on a long time. It wasn't just this night. This wasn't the first time. He had been pushing Daniel and others away for years. Daniel had been forced to endure being marginalized and ignored. I think of my friend. A lot of you know him, Harry Simpson. Harry died, I guess a couple years ago now. Harry, throughout his life, had been very opposed to anything having to do with Christianity. Harry's wife was a believer, loved the Lord, but she had to be pretty quiet about it around the house because Harry was really against it. She actually passed away before Harry ever came to faith, after years and years of marriage. Age 90. Things begin to break through in Harry's mind and heart, and Harry comes to a place of putting his faith for real in Jesus. Understood clearly what he was doing, and it changed him. Sometimes we have to wait, and it may not be our timing. And the fact is, for some of us, it may never be our turn to speak in some situations. I think that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego probably had suffered the same fate as Daniel, but they weren't called in that night to say anything. Only Daniel was the one who was put in the right place at the right time. And that is tough because some of us are so eager to put in our 2 cents. I know a woman who has been lecturing her kids for 70 years, doing everything she can to force them to faith. And then quite honestly, I think she has worked against herself for 70 years and has only pushed them farther away. What counts isn't what you have to say, but what God says. Daniel's words only had gravitas because God's hand had written the message. And then a few words for Belshazzar fans, because even villains have fans. I don't think that Belshazzar ever would have shown up at DCC on a Sunday morning. I don't think he would have filled out a welcome card. People like Belshazzar don't usually make it a habit of being regular church attenders, but occasionally, either out of desperation or maybe just for amusement, rebels do show up. And maybe you're one of them. I don't know who's here this morning. I don't know the reason why you came to church today. But maybe you're one of those people that this talk about God, to you has always been kind of a joke. It's always been held off out here. It's like, don't bother me with that stuff. It's just a lot of fantasy. You guys are all deluding yourselves. If that's you, the last thing I want you to walk away from in hearing this story of Belshazzar is the sense that if there is a God, he'd want nothing to do with you. So here's some things I think you need to know. First, there is a God. Belshazzar thought that he could party his problems away. But there was this serious, sober reality he should have been paying attention to, and that is that there was a God who was above him. Could I just encourage you, if this is something in your own mind, you think, is there really a God? Take a walk outside and just look around, honestly. Look at the world. Look at the complexity of it. Look at the beauty of it. Look at the balance of it, the intricacy, and ask yourself, do you honestly believe that this is all merely the accident of something that popped out of a mindless, empty vacuum of space? Or does it speak to the fact that there is a creator? There is someone intelligent above us. And then investigate Jesus. Don't just settle for a third-hand, I have heard. A lot of people have heard a lot of things about church. They've heard things about Jesus, and they form conclusions based on stuff that they think they heard, that somebody told them might be true, but they've never really honestly for themselves looked into it and figured out if it's true. And if it is true, it's important. You should figure that out. If you don't know where to start, at the danger of self-promotion, go check out thefaithpuzzle.org. It's kind of the story of my journey of going through doubt. And there's lots of book resources, and there's videos, and there's things there that if you really want to start a serious investigation, that's a good place to start. Second thing I would say is that the God that is there loves you. Best known verse in the Bible, John 3:16. For God so loved the world, he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. The God who is there loves you. He gave his Son. His desire is not to judge you, but to rescue you. And maybe you're saying, I don't need to be rescued. I don't need to be saved. And I would just ask you, is that really true? In your deepest heart of hearts, is it really true that you don't need to be rescued? Or is it that the hurt, the shame, the addictions, the failures of your past are so deep that you're convinced there isn't any way out? And if there was a God, he'd want nothing to do with you. The message of Jesus is that the God who made you loves you enough to do for you what you could not do for yourself, and that he is willing to free you and to give you a new life. The third thing I would say is that ultimately God is the judge. He is merciful, he is patient, but at the end of the day, he is the final judge. And you will stand before him someday. Belshazzar wasn't expecting it to be that night. Kobe Bryant wasn't expecting it to be January 26th. But when that day comes, when you stand before him, the fact that you don't believe in him won't make him go away. And smug comebacks aren't going to put God back on his heels like, wow, I never heard that one before. And you won't be able to claim ignorance. C.S. Lewis wrote an allegory, The Chronicles of Narnia, great story. And in it, he has a character, Aslan the lion. And Aslan represents Jesus Christ. And one of the characters in the story, young Susan, finds herself in Aslan's country. She has never met Aslan before. She's now hearing about him. And she's talking to her new friend, Mr. Beaver. And Mr. Beaver informs her that Aslan is a lion, a great lion. And Susan says, is he quite safe? I should feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. And I love Mr. Beaver's answer. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. Is God safe? Is the one who with a word, with a look, with a thought, can extinguish your life? Is he safe? Of course he isn't safe. He's the king. But he's good. That power, the power of that judge that we have every right to fear because of who he is and what he can do, has revealed himself to be good. Not good in the old grandfather sort of way that you children just do whatever you want, it's fine by me. But good in the sense that he loves what is good, and he's willing to love people who have messed up and to save us, to rescue us from our own badness, and to make us part of his family. Is he safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king. So what do? If you're that rebel, I think the first thing you do is you talk to God, because the issue really isn't about you and your parents or you and the pastor or you and anybody else. The issue is about you and God, and he's the one you need to talk to. So I'd start there. And then it might help to talk to someone who walks with God. Belshazzar would have been well served if he talked to Daniel a long time before that night. And maybe God has put some people in your life, people who love you. Maybe not that one person keeps lecturing you. I get it. You don't want to go to them. But there's some people that just love you, that would be willing to talk about it and talk calmly about it and help you think. Find one of those people that loves God and loves you that you can talk to. If you know anybody else, come and talk to me. I'd love to talk to you about it. And there are some of you right now that are thinking, I can hardly wait for this sermon video to be posted online so I can send it to... Would you please not do that? Let's close with prayer. Maybe you're one of those people that this morning you need to talk to God for yourself. And let me just help you with that if you don't know where to start. God, you know it is pretty easy for us to live our own lives for ourselves and try to ignore you. But if you really are there, then you really are the one who is worthy of everything. And I would ask you to make yourself real in my heart. I ask you to forgive me for all the ways that I have lived my life for myself and not for you. And I would ask you to come into my life and to rescue me from the things that I don't think there's any way out. Father, for the rest of us that have those rebels that we love, and it is so hard to wait, and we don't know how or when or if you're going to intervene. God, we just hold them up to you. We love them. We know that you love them. You love them more than we do. And Father, we pray that you would do the miracles that are necessary to draw those hearts to yourself. We ask that you would be their rescuer, that they would humble themselves. You'd give us wisdom, Lord, if we should speak or if we should be silent, that we wouldn't get in the way, Lord, but that we be part of the process that you are about. We ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.